March 1st, 1943 dawned grey and foreboding over Rabaul's heavily fortified harbour as Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura surveyed his precious convoy from the bridge of destroyer Shirayuki. 8 heavily laden transport vessels sat low in the water, their hulls packed with 7,000 Imperial Army soldiers of the 115th Regiment and 51st Division, along with critical artillery pieces and medical supplies desperately needed at Leh. The aged naval commander, weathered by 2 years of Pacific warfare, felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling upon his shoulders like a lead cloak. Every life aboard these ships depended upon his tactical decisions in the treacherous waters ahead. The convoy formation stretched across the harbour in a protective diamond pattern that Kimura had perfected through months of bitter experience running supplies through Allied-controlled skies. His 8 destroyers, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Shirayuki, Yukazi, Urakazi, Ishokazi and Hamakaze, formed a deadly steel ring around the vulnerable merchant vessels, their anti-aircraft guns bristling like metallic thorns against potential aerial assault. As documented in official Royal Australian Air Force historical records, Japanese naval intelligence had assured Kimura that Allied reconnaissance flights had been light in recent weeks, suggesting safe passage through the Bismarck Sea corridor to New Guinea. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto Kesuk, master of the transport vessel Kyok Maru, watched nervously as dock workers made final preparations to secure the last of his human cargo below decks. The young officer had witnessed too many convoy massacres in these contested waters, where American and Australian aircraft prowled like hungry sharks seeking Japanese blood. His ship carried 1,200 soldiers crammed into spaces designed for half that number, their equipment and personal belongings creating a maze of obstacles that would prove nightmarish should emergency evacuation become necessary during combat operations. The morning air hung thick with diesel fumes and the acrid smell of coal smoke as steam whistles shrieked across Rabaul's military harbour, signalling the convoy's imminent departure. Kimura's strategic plan called for a high-speed dash across 400 meters of open ocean, utilizing darkness and weather conditions to mask their approach to Leh's besieged garrison. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied air patrols typically focused their attention on northern shipping routes, leaving the central Bismarck Sea relatively unguarded during certain tidal periods. Final radio communications crackled between the escort destroyers as captains confirmed readiness status and ammunition counts for the perilous journey ahead. Each warship carried its maximum complement of anti-aircraft shells, depth charges and emergency medical supplies, while trained lookouts scanned the horizons for any sign of enemy reconnaissance aircraft that might betray their position to Allied command centers. The convoy success would mean survival for Leh's beleaguered defenders. Failure would cost thousands of lives and potentially collapse Japan's entire New Guinea defensive perimeter. As the harbor pilot boats guided the formation toward open water, Kimura couldn't shake the ominous feeling that unseen enemies were already plotting his convoy's destruction from hidden airfields scattered across northern Australia and captured Pacific islands. Squadron leader William Benn adjusted his leather flying gloves against the pre-dawn chill as he studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table at Port Moresby airfield. The grainy black and white images captured by a lone Royal Australian Air Force Hudson bomber just hours earlier revealed the devastating truth that would seal the fate of Kimura's convoy. 16 Japanese vessels moving in tight formation through the northern Bismarck Sea, completely exposed to daylight aerial assault. The Australian pilot's weathered face hardened as he calculated the tactical implications of this intelligence windfall. Knowing that such a concentrated target represented the largest Japanese convoy sighting in months of Pacific theater operations, Major Paul Pappy Gunn, the legendary American air tactician whose innovative B-25 modifications had revolutionized low-level attack techniques, leaned forward with barely contained excitement as target assignments were distributed among the assembled air crews. His experimental strafer bombers, equipped with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns and modified for devastating skip bombing attacks, had been waiting for precisely this type of opportunity to prove their tactical superiority over conventional high-altitude bombing methods. The veteran pilot's eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction as he recognized the perfect conditions for implementing his revolutionary combat theories against concentrated enemy shipping. Flight Lieutenant Bruce Watson of No. 30 Squadron RF received his mission briefing with characteristic Australian stoicism. Though his pulse quickened at the prospect of leading bow fighter twin-engine fighters into combat against such a significant enemy force, his aircraft, nicknamed Whispering Death by Japanese soldiers who feared their twin-engine roar, would spearhead the initial assault waves designed to suppress anti-aircraft defenses and create tactical openings for the heavier bombing formations following behind. The coordination required between Australian and American air units represented an unprecedented level of Allied cooperation in the Southwest Pacific theater. Captain Kenneth McCullough studied weather reports indicating perfect visibility and calm seas over the target area, conditions that would prove catastrophic for Japanese defensive capabilities, but ideal for Allied attack aircraft operating at minimum altitudes. His B-25 Mitchell bombers had been specially configured with additional nose-mounted cannons and machine guns, transforming them from traditional medium bombers into devastating ship-killing weapons, capable of delivering both explosive ordnance and concentrated gunfire against enemy vessels. The tactical doctrine developed through months of experimentation was about to receive its ultimate battlefield test. As dawn broke over the Allied airfields, ground crews worked frantically to arm and fuel nearly 100 aircraft, representing the largest concentrated airstrike yet assembled in the Southwest Pacific campaign. Bombs, rockets, ammunition belts, and fuel trucks created organized chaos across multiple runways as pilots completed final equipment checks and navigation calculations for the coordinated assault. Intelligence updates continued streaming in from reconnaissance flights, confirming that the Japanese convoy maintained its vulnerable formation while approaching the exact intercept coordinates predicted by Allied tactical planners. The stage was set for what would become known as one of the most devastating 15-minute periods in naval aviation history. Commander Hiroshi Tanaka gripped his binoculars with white knuckles as the first distant drone of aircraft engines echoed across the crystalline waters of the Huan Gulf on the morning of March 3rd. From his position aboard the transport tear, the veteran naval officer counted 16 dark specks approaching from the southeast, a sight that sent ice-cold dread racing through his experienced mind as he realized his convoy's carefully planned stealth approach had been utterly compromised by Allied reconnaissance capabilities. The tactical situation that had seemed manageable just hours earlier was rapidly deteriorating into a potential catastrophe that could cost thousands of Japanese lives in the space of minutes. Rear Admiral Kimura's voice crackled urgently over the radio frequencies as destroyer captains reported multiple aircraft formations converging on their position from various compass headings. The convoy commander's years of Pacific combat experience told him that such a coordinated approach indicated extensive pre-planning rather than an opportunistic encounter, suggesting that Allied intelligence had been tracking their movements since departure from Rabaul. Emergency battle stations' alarms began wailing across all 16 vessels as gun crews scrambled to their anti-aircraft positions, while transport captains ordered maximum speed in desperate attempts to reach the relative safety of Lay's coastal defenses. Lieutenant James Murphy, piloting the lead B-25 strafer of the 42nd Squadron, felt his adrenaline surge as the Japanese convoy appeared in perfect formation below his aircraft's modified nose section, bristling with 850 caliber machine guns. The months of intensive training and skip bombing techniques and low-level strafing attacks had prepared his squadron for precisely this type of target-rich environment where concentrated firepower could achieve maximum destruction against enemy shipping in minimal time. His radio crackled with target assignments as squadron leaders coordinated attack patterns designed to overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities through simultaneous multi-directional assaults. Aboard the destroyer Asashio, Chief Petty Officer Nakamura Toshio trained his 25mm anti-aircraft gun toward the approaching American bombers. His crew working with practice efficiency to prepare their defensive positions for the coming onslaught. The veteran gunner had survived numerous air attacks throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, but the sheer number of enemy aircraft bearing down on their convoy represented a level of concentrated firepower unlike anything he had previously encountered. His destroyer's captain shouted tactical instructions over the ship's communication system while maneuvering desperately to present the smallest possible target profile to the incoming aerial assault. The peaceful morning that had begun with such promise for the Japanese convoy was rapidly transforming into a nightmare scenario. As Allied aircraft approached their final attack positions, radio communications between convoy vessels became increasingly frantic as ship captains realized the hopelessness of their tactical situation. Surrounded by enemy aircraft with nowhere to run and insufficient firepower to mount an effective defense, the blue waters of the Bismarck Sea, which had seemed like a highway to salvation just hours earlier, were about to become a graveyard for thousands of Imperial Army soldiers who would never reach their destination or fire a shot in defense of their homeland. The final moments of peaceful sailing were ticking away as both sides prepared for what would become one of the most decisive and devastating naval air battles in Pacific War history. Flight Lieutenant Watson's bow fighters screamed down from 8,000 feet in a perfectly coordinated diving attack that caught the Japanese convoy's anti-aircraft gunners completely off guard at exactly 900 hours on March 3rd. The twin-engine fighters, 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns opened fire simultaneously, creating devastating curtains of lead that swept across the destroyer Shirayuki superstructure like a mechanical hurricane, killing dozens of sailors and obliterating most of her forward anti-aircraft positions in the first 30 seconds of combat. The Australian squadron's tactical doctrine of immediate defensive suppression was working exactly as planned, neutralizing Japanese countermeasures before the heavy bombers arrived to deliver their devastating payloads against the helpless transport vessels. Major Gunn's modified B-25 strafers followed the bow fighters down in a thunderous formation that transformed the morning air into a symphony of destruction, as 850 caliber machine guns per aircraft concentrated their fire on the packed transport ships. The innovative skip bombing technique that Gunn had pioneered involved approaching targets at mast-head height and releasing bombs at precise intervals to skip across the water surface before detonating against enemy hulls below the waterline. A tactic that proved devastatingly effective against the thin-skinned merchant vessels packed with human cargo. Explosions began rippling across the convoy formation as 500-pound bombs found their marks with deadly precision. Transport Captain Yamamoto watched in horror from Kyokusmaru's bridge as the lead American bomber pulled out of its attack run, leaving his sister ship Teo Maru wreathed in flames and listing heavily to starboard with massive holes torn through her hull plating. The screams of wounded and dying soldiers echoed across the water as the mortally damaged vessel began settling rapidly by the bow. Her cargo of artillery pieces and ammunition creating secondary explosions that lit the morning sky with orange flame. Emergency lifeboats were being lowered frantically, but the ship's severe list made evacuation procedures nearly impossible for the hundreds of troops trapped below decks. Destroyer Captain Sato of the Arashio attempted to lay protective smoke screens around the surviving transport vessels, but the overwhelming number of attacking aircraft made effective defensive maneuvering virtually impossible in the confined waters of the Huan Gulf. His ship's anti-aircraft guns fired continuously at the swirling mass of Allied bombers and fighters, occasionally scoring hits that sent damaged enemy aircraft spiraling toward the sea. But for every attacking plane driven off, 2 more seemed to take its place in the relentless aerial assault. Radio communications between convoy vessels had deteriorated into a chaos of desperate damage reports and pleading calls for assistance. The systematic destruction of Kimura's convoy was proceeding exactly according to Allied tactical plans. As Captain McCullough's formation of traditional B-25 bombers approached their release points at medium altitude, These aircraft carried conventional bomb loads designed to finish off any vessels that survived the initial low-level attacks, ensuring complete destruction of the Japanese force through multiple waves of coordinated strikes. The morning sun, which had seemed so promising just minutes earlier, now illuminated a scene of unprecedented carnage as the Bismarck Sea began filling with burning debris, oil slicks, and the desperate survivors of what had been the largest Japanese convoy operation in months. Within the first 5 minutes of combat, 3 transport vessels had already been sunk or mortally damaged, with thousands of Imperial Army soldiers dead or dying in the tropical waters. The systematic annihilation of Admiral Kimura's convoy reached its crescendo as Captain McCulloch's high-altitude B-25 formation released their bomb loads with mathematical precision, sending cascading explosions through the remaining transport vessels that had somehow survived the initial low-level attacks. The massive Kyokusei Maru, still struggling to maintain steerage way despite extensive damage to her superstructure, took 3 direct hits amid ships that detonated her ammunition storage compartments in a thunderous fireball visible from 50 miles away, instantly vaporizing nearly 800 Imperial Army soldiers who never had a chance to escape their steel coffin. The shockwave from this catastrophic explosion damaged several nearby vessels and sent towering columns of smoke and debris mushrooming into the tropical sky. Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship destroyer, Shirayuki, had become a floating furnace as aviation fuel from destroyed aircraft mixed with her own diesel stores to create an inferno that consumed everything combustible on the warship's upper decks. The veteran naval commander, his uniform singed and bloodied from shrapnel wounds, continued issuing tactical orders even as his communications equipment failed, and his anti-aircraft guns fell silent one by one under the relentless strafing attacks. His years of combat experience told him that the convoy was doomed, but his duty demanded that he fight to the last possible moment to save whatever lives remained among his scattered and burning vessels. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka abandoned his sinking transport vessel as the hull plates buckled and seawater rushed through massive tears created by skip bombing attacks that had penetrated below the waterline with devastating effectiveness. The officer struggled through oil, slicked water thick with floating debris, and the bodies of soldiers who had been killed instantly by machine gun fire or explosive detonations. His rescue attempts hampered by the continuing aerial assault that showed no signs of diminishing in intensity. Enemy fighters continued strafing the water to prevent organized rescue efforts, turning the traditional mercy of the sea into another killing ground for Japanese survivors. The destroyer Asashio, under the command of Captain Yamada Shintaro, had managed to avoid the worst of the bombing attacks through desperate high-speed maneuvering. But her crew was rapidly exhausting their anti-aircraft ammunition in futile attempts to drive off the swarms of Allied aircraft that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as the battle continued. Her 25mm guns had scored several hits on attacking bombers, sending at least 2 enemy aircraft crashing into the sea. But such minor victories were meaningless against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allied air armada. The captain realized with growing horror that his destroyer might be the only vessel in the entire convoy capable of returning to Rabaul with news of this catastrophic defeat. By the 10-minute mark of the aerial assault, 6 of the 8 transport vessels had been sunk or were sinking rapidly, while 3 of the 8 escort destroyers had been damaged so severely that their survival remained questionable. The Bismarck Sea around the convoy's last known position had become a hellscape of burning oil, floating wreckage, and desperate survivors clinging to whatever debris they could find, while Allied aircraft continued their methodical destruction of everything that remained afloat. The morning that had begun with such hope for reinforcing New Guinea's defenders was ending in one of the most complete tactical disasters in Japanese naval history. The last surviving transport vessel, Nojima Maru, listing severely to port, with her engine room flooded and most of her crew dead or wounded, presented a pitiful sight as Flight Lieutenant Robert Westbrook's P-38 Lightning fighters made their final strafing run through the debris-choked waters that had once been Admiral Kimura's proud convoy formation. Her captain, Commander Ishida Masayuki, had ordered the white flag raised in hopes of sparing the 800 wounded soldiers packed into her remaining intact compartments. But Allied pilots continued their attacks with relentless efficiency. Understanding that any survivors who reached New Guinea would simply become enemy combatants, requiring future military action, the systematic destruction of Japanese fighting capability took precedence over traditional maritime mercy in this total war environment. Destroyer Captain Yamada watched helplessly from Asashio's damaged bridge as his last two remaining sister ships, Tokitsukaze and Urakaze, succumbed to concentrated bombing attacks that left them broken and burning on the crystalline surface of the Bismarck Sea. Radio communications had been silent for several minutes, suggesting that Admiral Kimura's flagship had finally been overwhelmed by the devastating aerial assault that had transformed the morning into a nightmare beyond the worst fears of Japanese naval planners. The systematic coordination of the Allied attack, involving multiple aircraft types operating at different altitudes and attack profiles, represented a level of tactical sophistication that Imperial Navy doctrine had never anticipated or prepared to counter. Staff Sergeant Tommy Lynch, tail gunner aboard Major Gunn's lead B-25 strafer, documented the final moments of destruction through his aircraft's camera system as the last Japanese vessels disappeared beneath the waves in massive explosions of steam and smoke. The innovative skip-bombing tactics that had been developed through months of experimentation were proving devastatingly effective against concentrated enemy shipping, validating American tactical theories about low-level attack methods that traditional military doctrine had previously dismissed as too dangerous for practical implementation. His aircraft's ammunition counters showed nearly complete expenditure of all forward-firing ordnance, testament to the intensity of the 15-minute engagement. The waters around the convoy's final position had become a massive oil slick dotted with life rafts, floating debris, and the scattered survivors of what had been 7,000 Imperial Army troops just minutes earlier. Allied fighters continued patrolling the area to ensure that no organized rescue efforts could develop, while medium bombers photographed the destruction for intelligence analysis and propaganda purposes back in Australia and the United States. The complete tactical annihilation of such a large enemy force in such a short time frame represented an unprecedented victory for Allied air power doctrine in the Pacific theater. Captain McCullough's formation began the long flight back to Port Moresby as the final Japanese vessel settled beneath the tropical waters, with her battle end still flying from the main mast. A gesture of defiant honor that would be remembered long after the tactical details of this engagement faded from military memory. The Bismarck Sea, which had witnessed countless naval battles throughout the Pacific War, had never seen such complete and rapid destruction of an organized enemy force. Radio reports were already streaming back to Allied headquarters, describing the total elimination of the largest Japanese convoy attempted in months of Southwest Pacific operations. The 15 minutes that would reshape the strategic balance of the New Guinea campaign had finally ended in complete Allied victory. The silence that descended over the Bismarck Sea after the last Allied aircraft disappeared toward the horizon was broken only by the desperate cries of Japanese survivors clinging to wreckage scattered across 20 square miles of oil-slicked water that bore no resemblance to the peaceful shipping lane that Admiral Kimura's convoy had entered just 15 minutes earlier. Chief Petty Officer Nakamura, badly wounded and barely conscious, managed to grab a floating piece of deck planking from his destroyed ship as he watched the final remnants of destroyer Shirayuki slip beneath the waves with her battle flag still flying in defiant honor. The veteran sailor had survived the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, and numerous Solomon Islands engagements, but nothing in his combat experience had prepared him for the systematic devastation he had just witnessed. Captain Yamada's destroyer, Asashio, trailing black smoke from her damaged engine room and listing dangerously to starboard, represented the sole organized Japanese vessel capable of returning to Rabaul with news of the catastrophic defeat that had befallen the largest convoy operation attempted in months. His radio equipment had been destroyed by strafing attacks, leaving him unable to communicate the disaster to naval headquarters. while his medical officer reported over 60 casualties among a crew that had numbered 240 men when they departed from their home port just 2 days earlier. The systematic destruction of Japanese naval capability in 15 minutes represented a tactical revolution that would fundamentally alter Pacific War strategy. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, intelligence officer with the 5th Air Force, began compiling preliminary battle damage assessments as reconnaissance flights confirmed the complete destruction of all 8 Japanese transport vessels and 4 of their 8 destroyer escorts. His reports would eventually document that approximately 6,000 Imperial Army troops had perished in the attack, representing the largest single-day loss of Japanese ground forces in the entire Pacific theater up to that point in the war. The tactical implications of such devastating Allied air power superiority would force fundamental changes in Japanese convoy operations and strategic planning throughout the Southwest Pacific region. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, as Japanese High Command was forced to acknowledge that conventional convoy operations had become essentially impossible in Allied-controlled airspace. Future supply runs to isolated garrisons would require fundamentally different approaches, including submarine transport and nighttime small boat operations that could carry only fractions of the personnel and equipment that large convoy operations had previously delivered. The systematic destruction of Kimura's force effectively ended Japanese ability to reinforce their New Guinea positions with significant troop concentrations. Search and rescue operations commenced immediately as Allied naval vessels moved into the battle area to capture survivors for intelligence interrogation and to ensure that no organized enemy remnants could establish defensive positions on nearby islands. The humanitarian aspects of maritime warfare temporarily reasserted themselves as Australian and American sailors pulled exhausted Japanese soldiers from the water. Though the numbers of survivors represented only a tiny fraction of the massive enemy force that had been destroyed in the morning's engagement. Medical facilities at Port Moresby began preparing for an influx of prisoners requiring immediate treatment for wounds, burns, and exposure. The complete tactical success of the innovative air attack tactics would reshape Allied strategic planning for future Pacific operations, proving that concentrated air power could achieve decisive results against enemy naval forces without requiring surface engagement or submarine interdiction. General Douglas MacArthur received preliminary reports of the Bismarck Sea victory at his Brisbane headquarters with satisfaction that bordered on elation. Recognizing immediately that the tactical innovations demonstrated by his air commanders had fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout the Southwest Pacific theater. The complete destruction of such a large Japanese force in 15 minutes of coordinated aerial assault validated his controversial decisions to prioritize land-based aviation over traditional naval surface operations, proving that properly equipped and tactically trained bomber squadrons could achieve results previously requiring massive fleet engagements. His staff officers began revising operational plans for future campaigns, incorporating the lessons learned from this unprecedented demonstration of concentrated air power against enemy shipping. Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, understood that his innovative combat tactics had achieved something approaching tactical perfection in the systematic annihilation of Admiral Kimura's convoy. But he also recognized that such overwhelming success would prompt immediate Japanese countermeasures designed to neutralize Allied air superiority. Intelligence reports were already indicating increased enemy fighter patrols over traditional shipping routes, while Japanese naval architects were undoubtedly designing new convoy formations and defensive systems intended to counter the skip bombing and low-level strafing techniques that had proven so devastatingly effective. The tactical revolution would require constant evolution to maintain its strategic advantages. Prime Minister John Curtin of Australia received detailed briefings on the battle results with profound relief. Understanding that the elimination of 7,000 enemy troops destined for New Guinea represented a significant reduction in the immediate threat to Australian territorial security. The systematic destruction of such a large Japanese force also provided powerful propaganda material for home-front morale, demonstrating that Allied forces had achieved tactical superiority over the previously invincible Imperial Navy that had terrorized Pacific shipping for over a year. Parliamentary debates over military appropriations would now favor increased funding for the Royal Australian Air Force units that had participated so effectively in the coordinated attack. Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo received fragmentary airy reports of the disaster through submarine communications and surviving destroyer transmissions, but the complete scope of the catastrophe would not become clear for several days, as rescue operations revealed the true magnitude of personnel and equipment losses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized that conventional convoy operations had become prohibitively expensive in terms of both naval escorts and transported personnel, forcing fundamental revisions to Japanese strategic planning throughout the Pacific theater. The tactical balance that had favored defensive operations was shifting inexorably toward Allied offensive capabilities. War correspondents accompanying the Allied aircraft documented the battle through photographs and eyewitness accounts that would eventually reach newspapers throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, providing civilian populations with dramatic evidence of Allied tactical superiority over Japanese forces. The systematic destruction of enemy shipping in such a short time frame created powerful images of military effectiveness that contrasted sharply with earlier reports of Japanese victories and Allied retreats throughout the Pacific region. Public support for continued military operations would be significantly strengthened by news of such overwhelming tactical success. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had established new paradigms for naval warfare that would influence tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond, proving that concentrated air power could achieve strategic objectives previously requiring massive surface fleet operations. The wreckage of Admiral Kamura's convoy settled into the deep waters of the Bismarck Sea, carried with it the Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence in conventional surface operations throughout the Southwest Pacific, marking a fundamental shift in strategic thinking that would influence military doctrine for decades beyond the end of World War II. Historical analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey would eventually document that the 15-minute engagement represented the most cost-effective destruction of enemy personnel and equipment achieved by any single air operation during the entire Pacific campaign, validating revolutionary tactical concepts that transformed naval aviation from a supporting role into the dominant force in oceanic warfare. The systematic coordination between Australian and American air units established operational precedents that would define Allied cooperation throughout the remainder of the global conflict. Captain Yamada's heavily damaged destroyer Asashio limped back to Rabaul 3 days after the battle, carrying news of a disaster so complete that Japanese naval headquarters initially refused to accept the accuracy of his reports. Unable to comprehend how such a large and well-escorted convoy could be entirely eliminated in such a brief engagement. His detailed accounts of Allied tactical innovations, particularly the devastating effectiveness of skip bombing techniques and coordinated multi-altitude attacks, prompted immediate revisions to Japanese convoy procedures and defensive planning that would characterize military operations throughout the remaining years of Pacific warfare. The tactical lessons learned from surviving this catastrophic defeat would influence Imperial Navy doctrine until the final surrender in 1945. The revolutionary air combat tactics pioneered during the Bismarck Sea engagement were immediately disseminated throughout Allied air forces operating in all Pacific theaters, with detailed technical manuals and training programs designed to replicate the devastating effectiveness demonstrated by the 5th Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force units. Major guns, innovative aircraft modifications became standard equipment for bomber squadrons throughout the region. While the coordination techniques perfected during the 15-minute attack were incorporated into operational planning for future campaigns against Japanese-held territories, the tactical revolution that began over the waters near New Guinea would influence military aviation development throughout the post-war period. Japanese strategic planning underwent fundamental revisions, as High Command acknowledged that conventional convoy operations had become essentially impossible in contested airspace, forcing reliance on submarine transport, night operations, and small boat infiltration techniques that could deliver only minimal personnel and equipment to isolated garrisons. The complete destruction of 6,000 troops in a single engagement represented a personnel loss equivalent to an entire division, creating strategic gaps in defensive planning that would never be adequately filled, despite desperate attempts to maintain territorial control throughout the Southwest Pacific region. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had effectively ended Japanese ability to conduct large-scale reinforcement operations. Modern military historians studying the engagement recognize it as a pivotal demonstration of concentrated air power's ability to achieve decisive strategic results through tactical innovation and operational coordination, establishing precedents that would influence naval warfare doctrine through the Cold War period and into contemporary military planning. The 15 minutes that transformed the strategic balance in the Southwest Pacific demonstrated that technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and inter-service cooperation could overcome traditional naval superiority through revolutionary approaches to combat operations. The legacy of Admiral Kamura's destroyed convoy continues to influence military education and strategic thinking in naval meets throughout the world, serving as a definitive example of how tactical evolution can fundamentally alter the course of strategic campaigns. The Bismarck Sea remains a maritime graveyard, holding the remains of thousands of soldiers who never reached their destination. But their sacrifice contributed to tactical innovations that would help end the Pacific War more quickly and save countless additional lives on both sides of the conflict.